One area of your research focuses on understanding the patterns of continuity and change in personality and the mechanisms which affect them. Could you tell us a bit about your findings?
Sure. The field of personality is based on the very simple idea that there is something that is consistent in what we do and who we are. And so it's a fundamental question to the field: how consistent are people over time? And the question has been asked many, many times. And the one thing we did about 15 years ago was to compile all the evidence possible to track how consistent people were in terms of their personality across the life course. It's a question that up until that point had only been asked by individual researchers who had bothered to track their own cohort of individuals. And as I like to put it, it took living a life to understand how consistent personality was across the life. And I was less patient than that, so I decided to use the hard work of other people to compile all their data. And we showed quite definitively, as a 152 study meta-analysis, that personality traits are consistent, much more consistent than people had previously thought, especially at young ages. That the consistency increased with time and age, and that the peak of consistency actually occurred later in life than we expected. So the hardest possible person to change is a 50-year-old, like myself, whereas a young person is a bit more malleable, at least in terms of their personality. And then there seems to be a return to inconsistency in old age especially. And so this study tracked and basically established the fact that personality traits were quite consistent enough to satisfy the fundamental question about whether personality existed. We then turned to the question of change, because we don't view consistency and change as the opposite ends of the same spectrum. We understand that developmentally people can be consistent, but at the same time develop. For example, everybody could become more responsible with age. And so we did the same type of approach in a paper in 2006 where we compiled all the longitudinal studies we could find to track how people increase and decrease in terms of personality traits. And we found things like most people become more assertive and self-confident, especially in their 20s and 30s, which is nice. Most people become a little more agreeable or nicer as they age. It's not a very big effect. Most people become more conscientious, and they do so from starting at about age 20 and continue to change even in old age. Hopefully, most everybody becomes more emotionally stable too. That especially happens in young adulthood. And then finally, the last domain is what we describe as openness to experience, which carves a more unique pattern across the life course. People tend to increase when they're young and then decrease when they're old, which tracks very nicely with the political ideologies that people typically exhibit across the life course. And that trait domain is most strongly related to things like liberalism and conservatism. And so those two studies serve as a foundation to, let's say, setting the table for the questions of personality development across the life course. So they show quite definitively that there is something there that people will continue to exhibit as they age, and that there are developmental trends that occur across the life course, with the most interesting thing being really that people change most and most systematically in young adulthood, not in adolescence, not in old age, though they continue to change. And that fact alone is quite interesting from a human capital or a developmental perspective, because you're seeing gains in traits that are related to a lot of very important outcomes, and they're gains at a stage that most developmental psychologists hadn't considered a viable or interesting time of life to study. So those are the two basic studies. One mechanism that we've discussed and tested a number of times is what we call social investment. So one of the mysteries that arises from those fundamental studies is, why are people in young adulthood increasing in all of these very pro-social traits, especially as they transition from their 20s to their 30s? And we invoked and put forward the idea that it was the normative investments in conventional social roles, the transition from your family of origin to your family of destination, the transition from training and education to actually having a career and establishing yourself and committing yourself to an occupation or an identity. All of those types of transitions and the experiences that come with them, we've tested and have shown to be related to the increases in the traits that we found in the original study. So people who get married and stay married become more conscientious. People who gain status in their work also become more assertive, confident, and conscientious. And so you start seeing some of the relationships between what we think of as basic environmental mechanisms that contribute to the personality development patterns that we see.
Your work also focuses on conscientiousness. As a psychologist who works with economists, could you tell us about your approach to this topic?
I approach it like a psychologist, unfortunately. I think not like a psychologist, or an economist. My original inspiration for looking at conscientiousness was motivated by the developmental work. So the domain is fascinating from a developmental perspective because it shows changes at stages of the life that it shouldn't, right? Older people become more conscientious. That doesn't make much sense from a developmental perspective, and that in itself was a mystery that we set out to solve. Along the way, several questions invited themselves to be answered that started to, let's say, move us more towards the economic side of the equation. So the first question was, what is conscientiousness? And I thought that question was well answered when I started the effort, and I was wrong. And so we did a lot of work just trying to figure out not only what the family of traits are within conscientiousness, because it's not just one thing, it's a family of things, but how to measure them better, and what in general and theoretically and conceptually a trait like conscientiousness is. And so we've done a lot of work trying to define our terms better and define the concepts better. That led to a second question that we hadn't anticipated, which was what are the consequences of something like conscientiousness? I did not set out to understand the world from an economic lens, which is a very pragmatic one at some level, which is what utility does this dimension serve? And somewhat simultaneously, I will give Jim Heckman credit for this, he discovered these issues about a year before we published our big paper in 2007 on it. And we noticed each other at that point. We, of course, being in two different intellectual tribes, had not corresponded before then. But he published a very interesting and provocative paper in 2006 in the economic literature showing that individual differences that were not cognitive in orientation predicted a lot of very interesting outcomes. We published a similar paper in 2007 in the psychological literature showing that personality traits, with conscientiousness being one of the most important ones, predicting very, very important outcomes like mortality or longevity, marital stability, divorce, and also occupational success. And conscientiousness predicts all three of those in addition to other things. And that convergence, so to speak, let's say, forced us as psychologists to start thinking more in terms like economists. Like what are the practical uses of the knowledge that these things predict outcomes that are important to not only individuals but society? How do you go about systematically testing that, as opposed to psychologists will sometimes be less rigorous in their approach to testing ideas than economists will be, and suddenly we were forced to confront that. And so we've done a lot more research that I think is inspired by economists, especially their counterfactual thinking, to be much more disciplined with our inferences, and that's been a fun experience, I think.
Cool. Okay. In Different Forces, Same Consequence, you and your co-authors argue that conscientiousness and competence beliefs meaningfully predict academic effort and are associated with academic achievement. Given this important result, do you believe that conscientiousness is something which can be taught or fostered in early childhood?
Yes. Do I need to elaborate?
Can you elaborate?
Well, I think take a couple steps back. So one of the, I think, mistakes people make when they invoke something like personality is that they think of it as a biological temperament that you're born with, you're hardwired for, and it doesn't change. Which the only way you can invoke that idea is to ignore not only all the data out there, but also your personal experience. So there are very few psychologists who would go and back the idea that children don't develop. And so I think the question is obviously yes from the perspective that, yes, any personality psychologist would agree with the idea that especially children should be changing and should be capable of developing lots of different, let's call them personality factors, and should be trainable, and more trainable, I suspect, than older individuals. Sorry. That said, I don't think we have a lot of knowledge or understanding about how we should go about doing that. Largely because I think because of the preconceived notions about how personality works, people haven't thought about it as a target of intervention. Parents think about it all the time. And so if you have kids, two major goals are to make them polite and conscientious and happy. I know American populations like to have their kids be happy, but you also want them to behave properly. And so we do a lot as parents to putatively reinforce those behaviors. We do so very unsystematically without any guidance, I think, from social scientists about how to do it well. And in that respect, we're far behind, I think, the knowledge we have for intervening on behalf of things like cognitive abilities. If you think of educational systems, they're primarily designed to impart knowledge and skills that are more cognitive in orientation. We haven't dedicated ourselves as much to what it would take to make a 10-year-old into a conscientious 18-year-old per se. We've tried lots of things in a haphazard way, but not systematically. But I think it's a pretty good chance that it's changeable at that stage.
If conscientiousness was not acquired or learned at an early age, can it be taught to older individuals? Does an increase in conscientiousness change or affect other established aspects of one's personality?
To the first question, I'll say yes, but I don't have any data on it. But we have lots of analogous data. So, for example, we've taught older people to be smarter by training them on cognitive ability tests. And we show that if you train somebody on cognitive functioning, they increase their cognitive abilities temporarily. It often doesn't stick unless you get further training and practice. We've actually shown in a study of older individuals, 75 on average, that if you intervene on fluid intelligence, you actually get a secondary effect on openness to experience. And so we showed that you can teach an old dog new tricks, and that their personality is changeable even in old age. We didn't focus on conscientiousness per se. And so we don't have studies that we've used to intervene or to show interventions working on older people that showed changes in conscientiousness. As I was saying, we haven't done actual interventions to change conscientiousness, so we don't know. On the other hand, there's some really interesting observational studies. So one of my favorite is one done by Julien Morizot up in Quebec, where they followed two groups of young men. One group is a normal, everyday sample of Montrealans, and the other was a sample of men who had been incarcerated. And the fascinating thing was that they both showed the same patterns of development. So the non-adjudicated group showed the typical increases in personality traits like conscientiousness and emotional stability, and showed it in the right appropriate age period, the 20s. The adjudicated men showed the same pattern, but it was shifted. And so they started changing in their 30s and started increasing the same way. And, clearly it was a consequence, at least in part, of being in jail, which is not necessarily the best recipe for, let's say, normative development. But at the worst, in this situation, which was of course a dated samples back in the 70s, the opportunity or the pattern itself was just delayed, which provides nice evidence that even if you're older, you're going to develop in the normative fashion, once you're given the opportunity per se.
HCEO's mission is to carry out comprehensive and interdisciplinary research into human capital development. How is your work influenced by, and how does it influence interdisciplinary work on human capital and economic opportunity?
It's a good question. In many respects, I don't know. But we hope that what we do, let's say, helps to expand the imagination of both fields, for example. And I can only speak, of course, to psychology and economics. And I can say personally that I never would have conceptualized a career in which I would be interacting with economists until the opportunity to work with the HCEO group and with James Heckman and others like him availed itself. And that opportunity changed my perspective a lot in terms of how I approach not only my science, but the topics and the way we approach them. So, for example, I was quite hostile to the notion of simply predicting outcomes because it just wasn't something I was interested in. And I was taught, socialized by the economists to think differently about that whole enterprise. And so I hadn't thought about conscientiousness, for example, as human capital. I thought about it as an interesting construct. I liked it. It was something that I wanted to study. And now I think about it in a profoundly different fashion, alluding back to some of the findings we have. I no longer think about development simply as development, but as you would say, as the acquisition of human capital. And that's something I hadn't entertained as a possibility until getting involved with this group. The other thing that, of course, I think is important and has some potential to influence the economists is the idea that the soft side of psychology, the non-cognitive side of psychology, is in itself an important component of human capital. And it probably doesn't need to be said now, but I think we've proven quite definitively that these quote-unquote soft skills are quite hard in their consequences. And they're an untapped source of human capital in the sense that we just haven't let them into the realm of possibilities. So I'm quite optimistic and feel quite positive about the future in that respect, because we know from the studies we've done that there is an added benefit to consider these. From my perspective, I think we should consider more than what we do. And economists are, let's say, entertaining things like the Big Five and conscientiousness, but there are whole other enterprises or domains within psychology that offer the same type of opportunity that have yet to be explored, like vocational interests, for example, which tend to be independent of what you find with personality traits. And that whole process of seeing economists start to entertain a different repertoire of predictors for human capital has been greatly enjoyable to watch. And I hope to see it continue and to actually get established in a strong way.